This video is about analyzing music, and it is a guide particularly for undergraduate students who are doing choral studies at UKZN. What is an analysis of a piece of music? You may have already done some analysis in music theory, but when you come to history of music and when you come to looking at pieces of music in particular when you are going to perform them, analysis can have slightly different meanings. So, musical analysis is the study of musical structures. It tries to answer the question, how does a piece of music work? We are going to unpack that question because there are several components to it which will affect the way that you analyze a piece of music. Analysis usually divides a piece of music into its simplest parts in order to examine how each part works in relationship with the others. So from an academic point of view, we can then see why a composer has chosen to use particular aspects of melody or harmony. For performers, this becomes very important when we are going to interpret a piece of music. That is why we need to analyze it. So, for a moment, I just want you to step away from music so that you can have an analogy of why we would analyze music. I want you to consider your favorite meal, something you really enjoy eating. How do you make that meal, and what are the ingredients? Where do you get the ingredients? And what is the method for putting the ingredients together so that it will taste nice? So what little bits and pieces of each ingredient do you need to add? Then who taught you how to make that meal? At first, you will always remember the meal as a whole. You will enjoy eating the meal, so you'll have the tastes that you enjoyed. Well, music is very similar to this. The first time we hear a piece of music, we have the idea of all of the components of music working together. That is, the melody, the harmony, the rhythm, the accompaniment, and the musical instruments. When you think of the meal again, you'll remember that it has ingredients, it has a method of being put together, and also who taught you how to make that and why you enjoy it. All sorts of different things go into why you enjoy something that you eat. You might want to ask yourself, why would I want to know how to make something like a good meal? Well, perhaps you want to make it yourself, or perhaps you want to teach somebody else how to make that meal. The same is true of the analysis of music, and we'll see how important that can be in a moment. So, an analysis of music can examine all sorts of different things. It can, and it can do all of these things together, but it can do separately as well. So it can look at the melody or the structure of the melody. How did the composer put the melody together? Then it can look at rhythmic patterns and repetitions. Is the composition made up of little patterns that are repeated over and over again, or is the rhythm different from beginning to end? It can examine how the composer uses harmony or harmonic rhythm and harmonic style. What is harmonic rhythm? Well, harmonic rhythm is how quickly the harmony of the piece moves. If the harmony only changes once per bar, that is called slow harmonic rhythm. The harmony is just moving very, very slowly or changing very, very slowly. But if the harmony is changing every beat or every half beat, then the harmonic rhythm is said to be quick because it's changing so rapidly. Also, an analysis could look at the text, if there is one. So in choral music, there's almost always a text, and you are going to be looking at how the composer describes the text in music. You might also ask where the text comes from, who wrote it, and how did their context affect how it was written. Also, how does the text affect that the music was set? Then we might look at the musical form. How is the music set in the greater context of its performance? Is there an A section? Is there a B section? Is there a C section? And then, are those sections connected in some particular way, or are they quite distinct? The musical form might also be related to the text. So if the text is broken up into three sections, perhaps the music also reflects those sections. An analysis of music can also look at the historical background of the composer. And you might say, why is that important? Why do I need to know anything about the history of the piece? Well, the history of the piece can give you an inkling of why it was written in the first place. And that might give you a clue as to how you might interpret the piece. That's why it's important. You might also find that the composer at the time was going through particular issues in his or her life, and that has affected the way that the music comes forward. So, for example, if we were looking at a piece by Beethoven, if you were looking at a piece from early in his career, he was not deaf at that point, so it had quite an impact on the way that the music sounded. But if we look at a later piece, like his later string quartets, he was completely deaf by that stage, but yet he was still writing music, but in a much more complex harmonic space. Then we will also look at how people have interpreted the music. That means how they have made it come alive, either by performing or listening to a piece of music. I'll give you an example of that. Consider the song Bawo Tipo Somandla. Some people consider this song a freedom song because it says, what did we do? Was it because we were black? That is the assumption most of us make. But that song was first made popular in the 1980s by a group that had heard the song being performed by a group of disabled school children in Umtata. They could have been saying, what have we done to be born with disabilities? So there the context changes. But if you look at the words even more deeply, you'll see that they are very much associated with the season of Good Friday and Easter in the Christian tradition. So perhaps if you were to perform that piece in church, again the interpretation would be different. It's looking at Christ's suffering rather than our own. So we've had one piece and three different interpretations of it. So why would we analyze a piece of music? And here are four important reasons for you to remember. If you are looking at a piece of music, you might be wondering if it is suitable and if you can prepare it for the group that you are working with. Obviously, if you choose a piece of music that cannot be sung by your choir, there's no need to use it. So the first port of call when you are analyzing a piece of music is to see if the people that you intend this for, who are going to perform it, can they do it? Are they capable of singing high notes or low notes that are required by the composer? The second important reason is to understand the music. You cannot interpret a piece of music as a conductor or a performer if you do not understand what's actually going on. Yes, you could perform all of the notes correctly, but if you have a greater understanding of why the piece was written in the first place, you are more likely to give it a correct and convincing reading. Then there is interpretation, which is obviously linked to understanding. How are you going to make the music come across? If you know that the composer made the melody of the piece based on part of the harmony that he used or she used, you may find that that affects the way that you perform the music in the way that you play the chords or the way that you play the melody, for example. And then perhaps one of the most exciting parts of analyzing a piece is so that you can see what a composer has done to create the music, and then you can try and imitate that yourself. You can make your own composition. So that's the fourth reason, and perhaps the most creative reason of why we would analyze music. So let's go through each of these steps one by one so that you can see what kind of questions you would ask of a piece of music when you are going to analyze it. The first is this piece suitable for the type of choir that I lead? So number one, you're going to check the requirements of the piece. What is the distribution of the vocal parts? By this I mean, when you look at the soprano part, for example, does the soprano go up to a top A, top B, or top C? If it does, can your singers actually reach those notes? If your singers can't reach these notes, then there's no point in choosing the music in the first place, unless you are willing to work with your singers to get to that point. Then, Is there an accompaniment? If so, what instruments are required? Is the accompaniment technically difficult? So these are things that you'd need to ask. Firstly, if there is an accompaniment, who's going to play it? Are you going to play it? Is there a performer that you know who can play it? If you do know somebody who can play it, how much time do they need in order to be able to prepare it? Are they very good sight readers, or will they need several weeks to learn the part? That's why you'd need to ask, is the accompaniment technically difficult? And then also, if the piece is accompanied, but you're not going to have an accompaniment during the rehearsals, how are you going to prepare the accompaniment so that you can accompany the choir? Another question, is there a soloist, or are there several soloists in the piece of music that you have chosen? If there is a soloist, how are you going to choose the soloist? Are you going to have auditions from the people in the choir? Sometimes that can cause a bit of angst in the choir itself because one person has been chosen above the others. Sometimes it's better to choose a soloist from outside of the choir so that nobody feels threatened. But these are the kind of questions you need to consider beforehand. How are you going to choose music or a soloist for that music that will be appropriate before you introduce the piece to your choir? So those are the important parts of checking the suitability. Then, for preparation, how will I help the choir prepare this piece when they are singing? So we're looking at things like the length and the form of the piece. How am I going to break this piece up in every, what I would say, rehearsal? Are you going to learn the whole piece in one rehearsal? Or are you going to learn small pieces of it in several rehearsals? So how many bars are in this piece? Are you going to split it up into sections? Is it a fast or slow tempo, or a combination of different tempos? So if there are combinations of different tempos, are you going to teach the choir one section which is one tempo and then teach them another day the other tempo? Then how are you going to transition from the one tempo into the other? How is your conducting going to work when you change the tempos? How long is each section of the piece that you are learning? Perhaps there's a very long opening section, but a very short middle section, which is a quite contrasting feel to it, maybe even a slower tempo. How are you going to make those transitions when it is a long section and people can get tired while they're singing, so that the second section still sounds fresh when you perform it? You'll also want to look for difficult parts of a piece. When you're analyzing a piece in preparation for performance, you'll want to spend time with the choir on the most difficult part of the piece. It's no point spending 3 or 4 hours learning the easiest part of a piece and then leaving the most difficult part for maybe 15 or 20 minutes to learn. You'll want to learn the most difficult parts and spend the most time on those parts. So you'll need to identify them first so that you know when you get to them, you'll need to spend extra time on them. This is really about a time management kind of perspective that we're looking at. Then, are there difficult melodic lines? Sometimes you'll find that there are big leaps in a melody that are tricky to sing, or difficult intervals to sing. How are you going to teach those to your choir? The reason I put this kind of question in for you is that I found in my own experience that if you make a mistake when you are teaching a choir a particular vocal part, they are more likely to remember the mistake than the correction you make of that mistake later on. So if you know the difficult section first, then you are more likely to impart it well as a teacher to your choir. Then, are there any difficult rhythmic passages? If there are difficult rhythmic passages, you need to sort them out right at the beginning of your rehearsals, because rhythm is the foundation of all the music that you'll be working on. So, find any difficult rhythmic passages. Then another question you may ask is the piece in a foreign language? If it's in German or French or in Latin, what does the language actually mean? What are the words saying? Of course, when we are singing a piece of music, we want to impart the meaning of the words because that's why the composer set them in the first place. So what does the language mean? If you are not a native speaker of that language, you'll need to go and do some research to find out what the words mean and how to pronounce them. Then, are there any unusual chords or modulations? Of course, if there are difficult chords that are difficult to tune with choral singers working together, or if there are tricky modulations, you'll need to spend a lot of time making sure that the singers can go from one key to the next without feeling uncomfortable. At the end of this, when you've asked all of those questions of the piece, you may want to then ask yourself an additional question. What exercises or methods can I use to help the choir to learn this piece? That's why you're going to spend so much time asking questions of the piece and looking at it carefully before you even introduce it to the choir. If you go into a choral rehearsal never having seen a piece before, you're going to find that it's going to be much more difficult to learn effectively. I'm talking here about effective learning and also about learning that will encourage a really good interpretation of music. If you're not worried about those things, you could go into a rehearsal without having prepared at all. Now, the second part of why we might analyze a piece of music was understanding. We want to understand the music. So the questions you would ask for this kind of section is, who wrote this music? When was it written? And why was it written? The context is important for finding musical meaning. Now, you'll probably have realized at this stage in your education that music can have a different meaning for different people. If we all hear the same piece, we might draw different things from it. But the original piece of music was written for a particular time and for particular people. If we know what that context was, we might be able to give the original meaning when we give a performance of it in the present. And that is why these kind of questions are helpful. So, what is the text of the piece? We'd ask, who wrote the text of the piece? When was the text written? In what language is the text written? What does the text mean? And why did the composer choose to set this text to music? So I'll give you an example, and this is a piece that we'll be looking at just now. This is from a Zulu composer. His name is Sibisi, and he wrote a piece called the Zulu Mass. It has several movements in them, and one of it is called Ngiyakholwa, which means I believe. It's a standard text from the Roman Catholic Church. It is also used in the Anglican Church and also the Lutheran Church, and some other churches use it too. But it is declaring what a person believes in their Christian faith. Now, why did Sibisi decide to choose this particular text to set to music? We know that he wanted to write a piece of music in the style of the composer Haydn or in the style of Mozart, because he loved that style of music so much, and he said, why shouldn't there be a mass in Zulu in this style? And there wasn't one, so he wrote it, okay? But the text of the piece is much, much older. It dates back all the way to the beginning of, or near to the beginning of Christianity, from the year 325, which means it's been around for a very, very long time. Has it always existed in Zulu? No, it hasn't. In fact, for most of its history, it's been in Greek, but then has been translated into many different languages. It was translated into Zulu in the 19th century, so about 150 years ago, but has been refined somewhat in modern times. So what language was the text written in? In this particular case, if we were looking at Ngiyakholwa, it's in isiZulu. But if we were looking at the original text behind the Zulu version, it was written in Greek. What does the text mean? Well, this particular text is talking about the three different parts of the Holy Trinity, God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and what each of those sections of the Godhead mean. Of course, the meaning of God is quite a difficult thing to interpret, but that's what the text is about. Why did the composer choose to set this particular text? Well, the texts of the Mass or the communion service are related to the Roman Catholic Church. Many composers were setting those texts to music in the 17th and 18th century, and in fact long before that as well. But the kind of music that Sibisi was trying to imitate was written in the 18th century. So composers were writing particular styles of music to these texts, which were being performed in church. Knowing what the text of a piece means and how to pronounce it then helps us to sing it with understanding. So if you've never really understood the text of Giacomo, but you've sung it many times, you may want to ask yourself before you conduct it, what is the meaning of this piece? Did the composer try and get the meaning of the text over in the music? And we'll have a look at that and how he does in a minute. When we think we have found the meaning or the layers of meaning of a piece, we are going to try and highlight that when we sing it, okay? So, or we can give it a new meaning, but usually the reason we're going back into the history of the piece is to find out what the original meaning is so that we can try and interpret it in that original way. But there are times when you want to give new meaning to a piece, and I'll try and give you an example of that. I'm sure you all are familiar with the struggle song Senzeni Na, What Have We Done? It was particularly meant for struggle meetings, and it was often sung at funerals. More recently in our history, though, in 2008 and 2015, you will be aware that we had many uprisings against foreign nationals living in South Africa, living and working in South Africa. There were many reasons for these uprisings against foreign nationals. But many of those people who were being attacked were asking, why us? Why have you targeted us? So imagine now a Christian hymn writer who says, why don't I use that piece, which was so important during apartheid time, as a reaction against apartheid? What have we done? And why don't I replace it into a new context where it is the call of those who are being persecuted by South African citizens, often black against black. So now it has a new meaning. It's not asking, why me because I am black? It's asking, why me because I am a foreigner? There, a piece of music which has an established meaning has been given a new meaning. Now, to the interpretation. A question we may ask is, what clues are there in the musical score which show us how to perform this piece? So, related questions are there performance directions? These are things like, is it loud? Is it soft? Does it slow down at any time? Does it get faster? Must it rest for a while? Are some of the parts stronger than other parts? Are some of the parts meant to be softer? Are some of them meant to give special sound effects? Then there are also things like phrase markings. Are there long phrases that need to be brought out in your interpretation? Or are the musical phrases quite short and choppy? If they are not long phrases, why aren't there long phrases? Is it related to the text? Does the text have a choppy feeling to it that needs to be shown in the music? Then there are things like accents, staccato markings, tenutos, pauses, and other such directions. If you find those, you can see, the composer is trying to highlight a particular word or a particular chord to try and give the piece some more meaning. So these are reasons why you would look particularly for the performance directions that are given. Sometimes you'll find that composers don't actually include that many performance directions. That is when your own creativity is going to have to come in. You are going to make decisions about where particular words or notes or chords are going to be short or long, or if you're going to pause on them or not, to give a particular interpretation to the piece. Another related question to that is, once you've decided what all of the performance directions are and what they mean, how will you, as the conductor, actually show people how to do those when you conduct the music? If there's an accent, are you going to give a strong downbeat when you conduct? If there is a lovely lyrical line, are you going to show it in the way that you conduct? If it is staccato, are you going to give short, sharp directions? These are all questions related to your analysis of the piece. Then, how does the context or the meaning of a piece affect how it will be interpreted? So at this point, you've asked many different questions of the piece that you are preparing. The analysis of the piece has been showing us how to work out its meaning. But how does that meaning affect how we will communicate to the audience? Well, this is something that you will need to ask of yourself and decide for yourself, how am I going to do that when the choir sings? How am I going to teach the song in such a way that it will communicate what I hope it will say? Remember, music is a form of communication. We're trying to impart some kind of meaning. If you don't put meaning into it, well, it's not going to change the performance so much, but it will affect the way that people receive the music. So this is why it's so important. It lifts music to another level, another beauty, another way of enjoyment. One of the reasons for analyzing music is to imitate what a composer has done. And this is when you will ask, how did the composer put this piece together? And how did the poet who wrote the text put the text together? This is where we will ask, what compositional techniques did the composer use? Are there techniques like imitation? What does imitation mean? It means if you use exactly the same melodic material or same melody over again in another part. So the two parts are imitating each other. It may not be two parts, it could even be 3 or 4 parts. A fugue is a bit like that. There are 4 or 5 or 6 even imitated entries where the parts are almost exactly the same, if not exactly the same, but maybe at a distance of a fifth away from each other. Then there are things like diminution. Diminution means when rhythm is made much smaller. So if something in the original was crotchet, 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 if it's diminuted, it will be quaver, 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 made half of its original value. The opposite of that is augmentation. So if the original was crotchet, 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 an augmented version of that would be minim, minim, minim. That would make the music feel much slower, whereas diminution would make it much faster. Then there are things like canons. Many of you will have sung canons in our classes already as a form of sight reading. This is when one part starts, they start singing, then another part will come in with exactly the same music, but at a distance maybe of 5 or 6 notes. And I've already spoken about fugues, but there are all sorts of different techniques which composers can use to create music. Then you'll want to ask, did the composer use short melodic motives? What is a motive? Well, it's something very, very short, but which has a very distinct kind of character. So in music, like in Giacolwa, the opening section is very distinctive. It goes ba 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 di da di da di di di. That has a very distinct kind of rhythmic feel. Ba 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 di da di da di di di. You'll see that the composer, if you know this piece well, uses that di da di da di di da almost entirely through the piece in the accompaniment. So that gives it character. It's a very unique kind of sound, and so that helps us to say, oh, when I hear this, this is Giacolwa from Zulu Mass. It gives it its own identity. So when we can identify these melodic motives, we can say this is what identifies the piece as its unique self. But you'll also want to ask, how many different motives are there in this piece? And if we were to look at something like Giacolwa, we'd find 3 or 4 very distinct motives that give it its character. When you put them all together, it gives that particular piece its personality. Just like you and I have different character traits, when you put all of those character traits together, that gives us our entire personality. And the same is true of music. When you have these short melodic and rhythmic motives, each different ones, you put them together and you get a character or a personality of the piece. That is what we're trying to bring out when we are interpreting music. But it's also something that you can learn from composers. What does a composer do to put melodic motives or rhythmic motives together? What kind of structural procedures are they using in the music? Are they using chords, or are they using stepwise movements? Are they using large leaps in the melody to achieve that kind of particular character? Then, what kind of harmony does the composer use? We've looked at melody, but harmony is what underpins the melody. Does the composer use major or minor keys or different modes? If you're from a jazz tradition, you'll know about the different modes that are used. What kind of chords are used? Are they simple triads, or are they quartads and quintads? Are they 7th, 9th, 11th, and 13th chords? If there are, how are they used? Are there any chromatic chords that are used? Because that gives a kind of a spice to the music which isn't there if we just use major and minor chords. How are dissonant chords resolved? Do the dissonant chords resolve to other dissonant chords, or do they resolve to consonant chords? If there's a dissonance which resolves to a consonance, you have tension going to relaxation. But if you have dissonant going to another dissonant, going to another dissonant, you are creating a tense kind of feel in the music which needs to be resolved. If it doesn't resolve, the listener is left feeling as though something hasn't finished. A lot of modern music finishes on dissonant chords and you kind of feel as though it hasn't finished yet. But if a dissonant resolves, then you feel relaxation at the end. So this is why it's important. How does a composer set different chords next to each other to achieve a particular effect? So imagine if you have a text that is a very sad text and leaves the listener when you listen to the text alone, feeling despair. If you set that piece of music in the major key, there would be a dissonance between the meaning of the words and the meaning of the music. Major keys usually, not always, but usually portray much more light-hearted, happy feelings, whereas the minor key tends to, but not always again, tends to have a much more somber and quiet feel about it. Then, are there conventional cadences? I'm sure you're all familiar with perfect, plagal, interrupted, and imperfect cadences. But composers don't always use such cadences. There's a wide variety of different cadences. Are they conventional cadences? If they're not conventional cadences, how are they made up and how do they work? How do the voices resolve to each other, if they resolve at all? If you like the sound that these unconventional cadences make, how can you imitate that? So you'll have to see it how the composer puts all of the notes together to see if you could do that as well. Then here's something that I was talking to you about earlier, harmonic rhythm. Obviously, if a piece of music has a harmony change every beat, that means that the music is quite turbulent. It's moving all the time. But if the harmony only moves every 2 or 3 bars, then you're going to have a much more relaxed feeling about the music. Quite often, if you listen to pop music, for example, the harmonic rhythm is usually very slow. Okay? That means that the harmony is not very complex. But if you were to contrast that with something like a late romantic piece of music where there's a lot of chromatic harmony and it's moving very quickly, the texture is much more dense and you kind of feel much more heavy with it. That's why pop music tends to be much more light-hearted. Then also you might want to ask, how does the composer use harmony to follow the musical structure? So structures of music are usually bound to how the key is working. Does the composer start in the tonic key and modulate to the dominant? Is there any modulation at all? Or are there several modulations? Do the modulations try and show the meaning of the text, or are they just simply there because that's the way that the composer usually writes? Then, in relation to the text itself, you'll want to say, how does the composer actually treat the text? Now, some of you have learned with me a piece called Horizons by a South African composer called Peter Louis van Dijk. It's about the San people. And you'll know, if you've learned it with me, that there are many different African rhythms that appear and melodic phrases that are used that are very common of Southern African traditional music. But the text was written by the composer himself. This is a very unusual case because usually the text is written by someone and the composer sets the music that he didn't write the text of. So there are 2 different players in that kind of a setup. But Peter Louis van Dijk is also an excellent poet. So he writes the text and then he interprets the text, his own text, with music, which gives it a very integrated feel. But usually, as I said, the composer sets a text that is already existing by a different poet. So you'll want to say, does the composer retain the natural rhythms of the text, or does he upset the conventions? So if there are conventions of meter that are set up by the text, does the composer honor those conventions, or does he or she change them to give a particular meaning to the text? Then you might want to say, does the composer use melody or harmony to interpret the meaning of the text? This is sometimes called text painting. It's using music to highlight particular meanings. So I'll give you an example. Perhaps the text is about pain or suffering. If it's about pain or suffering, if you used dissonant chords on the word pain or suffering, that would make you feel angst on that word, particular tension on that word. But if you set those same words, pain and suffering, with a consonant chord, one that sounds nice, you kind of upset the meaning then, because the meaning is about hurt, about pain. So if you make the music pain itself, you will be giving that text a deeper meaning. Then, does the composer structure the music around the structure of the text? And again, I'm going to go back to that piece called Giacolwa by Sibisi. The text which he was setting, the credo or the creed, is set up in 3 distinct sections. One about the Father, one about the Son, one about the Holy Spirit. The music also does that. There's a specific section for the Father. Then a very different section about the Son. The music is quite different there. And then the music returns to the same sort of music of the first section for the third section. So there are 3 distinct sections of music which highlight the text or the meaning of the text. And then, does the composer reference any other famous music in relation to the text? Sometimes you'll find that a text has something that's quite familiar, that's been used by many poets, and other musicians have set that text before. A clever composer might say, I'm going to quote some music that I've heard before that is linked to this text in my own composition, so that it has added meaning. It's relating it to the past, but giving it a new interpretation in a new structure. So, in conclusion, all of these elements combined help us to decide how to select and carefully prepare an appropriate piece of music. They also help us to understand the possible meaning of the piece of music that we have chosen, to interpret the composer's intentions, and then finally, if we want to imitate that style in composition. If we take the time to do a full analysis of a piece, it will show in the way that we perform it, because it will give it a meaning of its own, a depth and quality which otherwise wouldn't be there.